Yeah, so today we have Professor William Sutherland at the University of Cambridge in the UK, and he holds the Miriam Rothschild Professorship in Conservation Biology, and also fellow of St. Catherine's College in Cambridge. And he has an extremely wide interest in almost any topics in ecology, conservation biology, or decision-making processes. But in particular, he is committed to facilitating conservation based on solid scientific evidence. It's called evidence-based conservation, and that's why he launched the Conservation Evidence Project in 2005-ish, I guess. Four. And also he has been awarded so many awards, but most notably in 2021 awarded the CBE for services to evidence-based conservation, which sounds amazing. And he recently published an edited book, Transforming Conservation, Practical Guide to Evidence and Decision Making. So I'm sure he will talk about it and book in more detail. And personally, I started my career with reading one of his books called From Behavior to Population Ecology. And I first met him almost 20 years ago in one of the international ornithological conferences. And he reviewed one of my very first papers, and he was not too harsh. And he's a host researcher when I was based in Cambridge for almost 9 years. And since then, we have been closely collaborating with each other. So it is my real pleasure to be able to chair this presentation today. Thanks very much, Bill, and over to you.
Thanks very much, Tatsuya. It's great to be on hallowed ground, on such a famous place. As I'm sure you're aware of how well respected you are around the world. I'd also like to begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet and pay my respect to the elders, past and present, and I extend that respect to Aboriginals and Torres Island people here today. And I'd just like to say, I like the idea of respecting elders. It seems a great thing to be doing. The UQ is fantastic. I'd also like to say how I produce clever stuff, but almost all that stuff that Tatsuya has done. So it's that collaboration has been wonderful. So what I'd like to do here is talk about evidence use. And so the brilliant idea I have is that we should do more of the things that work and less of the things that don't work. And if we did that, it would transform the subject of conservation and almost everything else. So yeah, so we're interested in how do you look at evidence, and that's what I want to do. I want to talk about what we've been doing and what needs to be done. As Tatsuya said, we just completed this book. It's a book about how to make decisions. It's got a strong Australian input. There's Australians are leading figures in thinking about decision making, thinking about how you use experts. So there's lots of Australian authors involved in this, and lots of the ideas from Australia are in there. We can click on the screen again. Anyway. Good. So the main idea is that the way of thinking about a conservation project is to deliver change. You identify who's going to be involved, you frame the problem, you make a decision, you embed that into practice, and you learn from practice. This is kind of what all of you lot do. This is kind of central to that. And what you need to do is two elements. You need to create a demand for evidence use, and you need to collate the evidence. And our assessment was that there were two major problems, that we're not strategic and there isn't a culture of evidence use. We're not strategic and we don't have the evidence sitting there waiting to be used. And there's not a culture of evidence use, so it's kind of acceptable not to use evidence. It's kind of remarkable, but that's kind of how it works. And it still blows my mind that that's where we are, but that's where we are. So one of the things we have is something called metadata set. And metadata set, so I'm going to talk about the way in which we analyze data, the way in which we do our reviews, because it's kind of different from the way everybody else does it. The way everyone else does it is they tackle a review one at a time. We want to analyze data and do reviews on an industrial scale, and so that the information is just sitting there waiting for you to use. We think that's the 21st century way of doing things. So you set up something called metadata set, which has 15,000 effect sizes stored in it. And we could say, so we're interested in controlling invasive species. There's a whole range of invasive species. Let's say we're going to look at Japanese knotweed. Where, what are the outcomes? Let's look at the abundance of the invasive. Then we could say, let's look at what we're going to look at. We could say we're going to look at physical control and look at the effectiveness of physical control. And then we could say we're going to look at, we're interested in looking at particular countries. So there's a database sitting there, and then you can do the analysis you want to do in relation to the problem that you're concerned about. Rather than the normal way in which it works, you have a systematic review, and they say, here are the 3 or 4 analyses we've done which you think are important. And I like to illustrate that with Spartina. Xi Jinping, in the middle of January, said, we're going to get rid of Spartina from China. Spartina is an invasive grass that occurs on the coasts. It says we're going to get rid of it, and every province has to produce a management plan by the end of February. So we thought, well, let's inject the evidence into that process. And we went to metadata set. Can we get rid of the top of that or not? Very good, thank you. So we went to metadata set and we said, let's look at the effectiveness of integrated controls or habitat management or biological management or chemical management or physical management. The details of this doesn't really matter. Yeah, sorry.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Or let's look at the effectiveness of different herbicides, and you can do that. And we've done this alongside working with experts. So one of the most effective techniques, according to this, is using vinegar. And then our experts said, hang on a minute, and the experiments on vinegar are done in little pots in greenhouses. And if you have some Spartina in a little pot in a greenhouse, then immersing it in green vinegar is a very good way of killing it. If you're going to control it on a landscape scale, and you then did the calculations, it was sort of, you needed to add a gazillion liters of vinegar to the landscape. Now, completely unrealistic. So you need to use experts to think about this as well. And then what are the side effects? So this shows the consequences for native animals of just the different management techniques done globally, and because it's China, just done for Chinese data. So we did this analysis in a day or two. So the point we're making is not the actual details, but if you have the data sitting there, you can do a bespoke analysis for the thing that you care about, very quickly. We on Invasive Species Day on Twitter, we're doing reviews in 20 minutes. Give us a problem, give you the answer 20 minutes later. So metadata set has the data sitting there, has the meta-analysis tools, the tools for looking at bias, all just sitting there. So you can do your analysis and do it quickly. And we think that's where we want to be. We want practitioners and policymakers to be able to look up the evidence for their problem. I just want to look at Chinese data. I just want to look at the consequences. You might say, well, let's look at the evidence for the different herbicides. Whatever you want to do, you can then do. And then, so China, so this is in paper in Science, piece in Science, this week's Science, talking about this and talking about our review. Sam Reynolds was the person who led the review and looking at the consequences. So you can do that very quick response, and that's where we think we want to be. And then to get it used, this is the Chinese version, and we're getting embedded within practice, and there's various groups in China who know the mechanisms. So we're getting that used. So that's one of the approaches we use, and so it's slightly confusing, but we use 2 different approaches. That's very useful when there's specific effect sizes that are comparable. With invasive species, they are. In most of conservation, there are lots of different measures. And one of the things we should do is try to standardize those measures. But there are lots of different measures that make them hard to compare. So we use a slightly different approach that I'm now going to describe. And we use a process called subject-wide evidence synthesis. So rather than taking one topic at a time, we take a broad topic like bat conservation and look at all issues to do with bat conservation. So you say for bat conservation, what are the different threats? One of the threats is that they really don't like wind turbines. Apparently the low pressure as the blade goes by means that their lungs come out, which is horrible. And then what are the things you could do? You could switch off the turbine at low speeds, you could deter them using ultrasonic, you could deter them using radar. These are the things, this is what we call option scanning. This is the list of all the possible options that a team of people can think of in relation to bat conservation. We read the conservation journals and report the studies looking at interventions. And when we've been looking at mammals, we then read the mammal journals and pulled out the papers that list the work with interventions. And in collaboration with Tatsuo, done this in 17 different languages. And we've read collectively 1.6 billion journal titles. And we pull out, thankfully, conservationists tend not to study the solutions or answers. They tend to look at threats and problems rather than solutions. So the literature is actually quite a small part of that, which makes this doable. But you can say, here is a list of some of the papers that have tested interventions. And we've got thousands of these. And then this is the clever bit. We can then put these papers we've extracted under the threats and the options. And this means we're effectively doing hundreds of reviews simultaneously. So for the bat, we might have done, I can't remember what it is, 200 reviews simultaneously, including many of which there are no studies. And we're happy with that. We say we couldn't find any studies, but we think that is a useful thing to do. It will be very expensive to do a systematic review, to say, well, I think there probably isn't any literature, I'm going to do that, and I'm going to confirm there isn't any literature. It's a very extravagant approach. So each of these reviews on average costs us about £1,000. So it's a very cost-effective way of doing it. So how does it work? This is the conservation evidence database. Let's suppose we're interested in roads. This will say there are 84 actions. Here are a list of the different things you could do for amphibians or bats, or monkeys. These are the different things you could do. And then here are for culverts, amphibians. Here are the key messages as to what works, using studies in Australia, other places. Here's a map. Apologies for cutting out. If I'd have thought about it, I wouldn't cut off Australia from this slide. But anyway, I apologize. This is the summary. And then if you click on here, it'll put a box around the 7 studies that it refers to there. And this is the detail of each of those studies. So you as a practitioner have a problem. You can look generally what is the solution. You can look at the individual studies and you can access that and you can do it in minutes. There's something I call my party trick, which is I'm at a meeting, I'm at a government meeting, and we're talking about something, and I will look it up. I've done it this week, done it a few times this week at a meeting I'm at. You can look things up in minutes and then say, well, the evidence shows this. There's a mock that's happening. I'm looking at the evidence, and I could look up the evidence and say, so well, actually, there are other studies showing this. So you can do things really quickly to see what the evidence says. And then we then classify what works, and we do this by expert elicitation because there's a whole range of different measures. You can't do a standard meta-analysis because, you know, some people are looking at diversity, some people are looking at numbers, some are looking at behavior, people are measuring it in different ways. It's hard to put that together. So we use a measure of how effective it seems to be, how certain it seems to be, and whether or not there's any harm, and then categorize it in this way. So, for example, the Kent Wildlife Trust worked out that they do 550 different interventions. They then classified those according to the effectiveness. They've matched them to the conservation evidence database. And I can say, well, here we haven't got a name, here we haven't assessed them. This is where we're waiting to assessment. That seems to be pretty good. This seems to be fairly good, but there's some here which the evidence suggests doesn't work. And they focus on those and they say, do they think they've got it wrong and they want to rethink it? Or do they think that the evidence applies to other situations and it isn't a concern? So it's an effective way of looking, of matching what they're doing against the evidence at scale. And that's what we're interested in, not fiddly little details. We want to do things at scale. Or AmeriCorps, which is an American organization working with volunteers, they had the target of increasing each year the proportion of their activities that are shown to be effective based on the evidence. And they've done that. You know, each year, more of their actions are beneficial. And US Fish and Wildlife set the same target, and we're working with them to create the same measure. So either with conservation evidence or other data sources, which of these actions seem to be beneficial, and then trying to improve the evidence base, trying to improve the evidence collation, so that they can be resting assured that they're spending money on things that seem to be effective. And that seemed to be a pretty good thing to do. So that's where we've been. I'd like to talk, this is a lot of the thinking we've been doing, particularly in relation to the book. We're going back to the old idea of weighing evidence. Remember the Greek scales of weighing the evidence, where you have blocks of evidence when you think about it. And the way we think about it is you have a weight of evidence as a block. And there are three axes to this. Firstly is how reliable is the information? So if this is a study, this might be a randomized controlled trial, and this would be some dodgy experimental design. Or if it's an observation, this would be something pretty flaky, and this would be some DNA or some video or something like that. How reliable is the source? So is it that it comes from published in a well-known journal, or does it come from a publication that has a very clear agenda, or a person that has a very clear agenda? And then how relevant is it? Is it in the same location, or does it refer to a different location, a different species, a different problem? So imagine combining all of those and saying that is the weight of the evidence that we're thinking about. And then, so imagine the simple issue of is something true or not. We can say, let's weight the bits of evidence we have, and this is what we call the improbability. How unlikely is that to be true? So, and then we give each one of these a score from 0, meaning each of these axes from 0, don't believe a word of it, 5, we trust it a lot. So the information reliability, so is it a really good study, or is it a dodgy one? The source, is it something we really trust, or is it really someone's got an agenda and they're just forcing something on us? And the relevance, is it something that relates to what we're doing, or something completely different? So you can imagine those blocks of evidence. And so you then take those blocks of evidence. So imagine this morning, I was talking to someone, he's got a good eBird list. He's been bird watching in the Botanic Gardens this morning, saw 40 species, was talking about how to identify different honey guides, honey eaters. And he said he'd just seen an Australian white ibis in the hotel restaurant where it's feeding on the grass and walking between tables. Do you believe that? So what score are we going to give it? What information reliability are we going to give it? Anyone like to have a guess as to how would you score the different elements of this? How would you score the information? Who's going to give me that guy? Who's a brave person? 1? 3? I'd go for it, yeah. 3. You don't know much about it, but it seems. What do you think of the source? How much do you trust the source? 4, okay, yeah. And the relevance? How relevant is this observation to whether or not you get them in the restaurant? Oh, it's a 5, yeah, okay, so 3, 4, 5. So you can block of weight that size. And then how unlikely is that to be true? What do you think? How unlikely is this observation? Is it small or high? It's very small, yeah. So do we sort of believe this? Yeah, I think we sort of believe it. We kind of, that's likely to be true. You know, that there's some okay evidence. It's not very unlikely. So yeah, let's believe it. And I was chatting to another person this morning. He's got a good eBird list and been in the Botanic Garden. Remarkably, he'd also been in the Botanic Gardens and seen 40 species. And we're also talking to him about honeyeaters. Thank you. You shot it. Sorry. No, exactly. Honeyguides would be fun. Yeah, for that weekend. And he's just seen a dodo on a lawn where it was walking slowly and feeding on seeds. What score do we give this person?
5.
I hope you agree. We actually give, this is the same observation, we give it the same score. But what do we think of the improbability? Yeah, the improbability is sort of vast, you know, kind of, you know, in order to believe it, we'd want videos, we'd want DNA, we'd want to know about his recreational drug use, all that sort of thing. And decide whether or not, you know, we'd want really, really, really strong evidence in order to do that. So that weighting, I hope you can see how that weighting would work. The other thing you could weight is a statement. So here is, you know, is this action effectiveness? So this says this works really well. This says it's really damaging. You're going to put the different bits, the different blocks of evidence on this and see how strong the evidence is. And what we're doing here is imagine that you take those blocks and you add them up, you multiply them up. So we had a 3 and a 4 and a 5. Never do maths in public. That's a block of 60, I think. Especially on the video. Oh, I can edit it out. So if I get it wrong, I edit it out. So 3 and 4 and 5. So you've got a block of 60. So that's the evidence weight. And imagine you just add those up. So if you've got 2 maximum studies, would say it's overwhelming evidence. If it's small, it's negligible evidence. So it can combine the strength of the evidence, as I said, from here it's negligible, to here it's overwhelming, and the mean effectiveness. So here, considerable benefit, it works really well. Here, considerable harms. And we can put those together for every combination. So we can use this to say, for that statement, for this action, how are we going to describe it? Are we going to say, here there's moderate evidence of little benefit? For this one, we say there's strong evidence of considerable harm. It's a way of putting this evidence together based on our assessment of individual bits of evidence. And then a lot of what I think we need a lot more thinking about this. You know, what do we mean by information? I'm going to talk more about that. But then how do we assess sources? What's a reasonable way of saying, well, we trust this source and we don't trust that source? What are the ways in which we can do that? And then something we're really interested in, how do you look at reliability, relevance? How do you weight studies that are different distances away or on different species? You can sort of say, well, I don't think that's very relevant, but that's very relevant. But we want to do something a bit more rigorously, and we don't really know how to do that. So what I would like to do is talk about the accuracy of experiments, and this is work done by Alec Christie. And he says that there are 6 experimental designs. So imagine here you've got 3 fields over 3 years, and you watch those fields for 3 years, and there are some masked lapwings on them. And then you do some action here, and then you measure those for the next few years. You can do first things. Firstly, you could just look at what happens afterwards. So this is done commonly. You set up a marine protected area. You want to see how the fish numbers increase after that marine protected area. Or you could measure it before and measure it after, before and after experiments. Or you could do control versus impact. Control, impact versus control. This is where it hasn't been done. Or you could do a vacuum design before and after control and impact. Or it could be randomized and controlled. So it's randomized control impact or randomized before and after control impact. So you've got those 6 experiments done. And Alec found 44 really large experiments, ecological experiments, where people had measured stuff before and measured it afterwards and had controls and had experimental sites and had replicas. So there's this huge database he had. So you can then look at the variance, but also strip it down to see what the consequences are if you look at small experiments. And this shows, so let's imagine we only want to know, are we getting in the right direction? So if in truth the experiment should, if in truth beetle numbers increase, how likely is it that our data shows that beetle numbers increase? So let's imagine we do a randomized control trial, then in 95% of the times we get it right, and if we have 50 replicas, then whatever it is, 97% of the time, we got it right. That's pretty good. At the other extreme, if you have the after experiment, you kind of get it right about 50% of the time. And if you do lots of them, because this is such a useless way of doing it, it doesn't actually improve on the accuracy of getting it right. Now, what do we think is the most common experimental design in conservation and social science? Yes, this is the most common experimental design. And kind of, this shows it's kind of, there's lots of problems. And similarly, you can say, supposing you want to get your result accurate to a certain amount. So ideally, you want to rank within 10% or 30%, but let's just imagine you got it right to within 50%. So it increases by 20%. You get it right to within 50%. So you might say it's within 10% to 30%. So let's look then at the different experimental designs. Again, randomized control trials, batty designs, you get it right reasonable percentage of the time. And the after, here on something like 16% of occasions, you get it right to within 50%. So that means that in 84% of occasions, you don't get the result right to within 50%. I think this shows two things. It shows the importance of experimental design. As you're all taught early on, experimental design matters. This says experimental design really, really matters. A good experiment delivers a lot more. Weak experiments tell us very little. It also says that we can quantify the accuracy of different experiments. So we can then say, well, this is likely to be right to this level. But I think that's important. And then we wanted to, for the last couple of years, I've been thinking about two things. I've been thinking about how do you combine different studies and how do you weight different experimental designs? And I'm delighted to say we kind of largely solved both of these problems yesterday afternoon. This is for Tatsuo's Nobel Prize speech. This is the moment where we just thought of it, and here is the random scribblings in the notebook with the answer. So anyway, that was exciting. So that alone made it worth coming here. So we want to look very much at these measures and think about how you can assess those. And I think there's a lot of work left to be done. So this is how we think about it. There's two elements to it. There's the specific, and that's what you care about. If you're a practitioner, you're going to do an action on a specific bit of land. But then there's kind of, as scientists, we want to know about the generality, and that's what we've got to pull together. You can't do it for every site. You've got to look at the general patterns. So if you've got a specific problem, I want to know about how I'm going to manage the lake on the campus here. Once it's being restored, how am I going to do that? What we do is we look at the general studies, and then we apply that for our local conditions and says, what is the evidence? Let's look at all those studies, work out which ones we believe, which ones we don't, which studies from different parts of the world we find useful. We then decide on actions for local conditions, and this involves thinking about your values, thinking about your local experience, and combining that with the knowledge. And then something we're really keen on is embedding tests of single actions. People tend to measure the effectiveness of a whole program, which tells us almost nothing. If you create that lake, you're going to get ducks on it, and you're going to get ibises around the side, and you're going to get dusky moorhens. Kind of course, kind of, you don't learn anything from that. If you then tested by putting different slopes of edges or different nesting boxes or something like that, that's when you learn. And then we will then want to collate these tests globally, analyze them, bring that together, meta-analysis, the sort of approach we described earlier, and then draw our general conclusions. We say, in general, this sort of slope works best for creating wetlands. In general, this sort of nesting box works best. And then that goes back to the specific conditions. And then, so how do we express that evidence? This is what we call ziggurat plots. As I'm sure you know, ziggurats are Mesopotamian stepped buildings. And these sort of look a bit like stepped buildings. And we then, so each of these blocks up is a study. And the maximum, if it was 5 by 5 by 5 of the 3 different axes, will be 125. We then work out how good the evidence is for one study, and then another study. So there's 2 studies where there's lots of good evidence, one where there's a little bit of evidence, and then 2 with sort of kind of flaky evidence. And we then say, here, is there large positive effects, large negative effects, and put that information together. So with the Foundations for Success, with Nick Solaski's group, and with us, we've been looking at the MARVA grants. MARVA is one of the big European funding organizations, does a lot of work in Africa, spent a huge amount of money, but they're closing down. And we were reviewing the evidence that came out of the MARVA project. And here if they use organizations use flexible funding to invest in organizational development, we could bring that together and then present this as a collation of the evidence that could be used. And then that's how. Okay. So what I'd like to talk about is we've got these bits of evidence. How do we use those bits of evidence and express it? And there are 4 techniques that which I think you probably all know, but I kind of just want to express it, and particularly the way in which you can embed evidence. There are things called argument maps. We did this with Mark Bergman, who I suspect you all know. And it's a bit of a painful thing to do, but it forces your thinking. It's painful because you have to think rigorously. You say, no, that won't do. You've got to think more rigorously. And it forces you, there's a structured way in which you create these arguments. And once you've done that, you can press a button and it'll give you a paragraph that will specify that argument. It's a very logical way of doing it. And including, we put the evidence in the argument maps. And here is just the nature of the evidence that we present. And then we did some sort of assessment. So here is the evidence with the number of scores. So we think that's a useful way of presenting it. The second approach is what's called a mind map. Here we're interested in preserving snipe. And it seems that there's 4 main issues. They've got to have some food, and they've got to have somewhere to nest, and they don't like animals stampling on them, and they don't like being eaten by predators. And then you can say for predation, what are the different factors involved? So for food, they kind of like aquatic invertebrates, and if you create pools, that seems to work, but also like soil invertebrates. But if they're flooded, then that kills the soil invertebrates, and penetrability seems to be key. So you want to keep it damp, or you want to create these rills, these sort of shallow ditches. So you can lay all of that down, and then you can add the evidence on top of this. And we think this is a very good way of presenting complicated sets of arguments that you can have a look at. I should say that I think a mental argument map is how we make almost all decisions. You think of if you sat in on decision-making processes, and many of you have, more senior members have sat in on hundreds of these. My experience is what happens is you've got an issue, are we going to Are we going to create a new center? Are we going to move here? Are we going to expand in this area or not? And then you have sort of this discussion where you, what about this? Yeah. And then what about if we did this? That might be good, that might be bad. And then we could think about this. And then what if instead we should do this and whatever, do this. And then the chair says, so I think we've decided this. Is that unfair? Is that how decisions are made? That, in my experience, there's not a structure to it. There's a sort of rambling, wandering around the topic, and then coming out and saying that's the answer. And I think if we presented it, if you present it, it forces your thinking a bit more and it lays it all down. So I think we should do a lot more of that. And again, this is the evidence. We have it so that the evidence is sitting there. So if you want to question the evidence, you can go and look at that and then say, well, actually, you think the evidence is good. I disagree. The third issue is the idea of theory of change. Here you start off by assessing the problem, but then you say, this is what we're going to do. We're going to get rid of rats we're going to check that the local traditional owners are happy with that. The rat control efforts are then going to get rid of the rats, so they're eliminated. And there's also biosecurity techniques, so no new rats come along. And if that happens, then nest predation will happen. Nest predation will be reduced, so there'll be more seabirds, which is great for the seabirds, and it's also a culturally important food source for other people. So this is a theory of change, saying this is what you're going to do, and here are what the outputs are. And again, we can put the evidence on top of that, and here to say what are the assumptions, and then what is the evidence for this. So this says, rather than just a sort of rambling, I think we're going to do this, it forces you to think as to what the logic is behind it. And then the final approach, the final but one approach is a multi-criteria analysis, massively underused method. Here you say, what are the different things you can do? You always have do nothing, and here just a set of different proposals, and you want to know what are the consequences for breeding birds and fish numbers and downstream flood events, sediment and tourism. You lay all those, and you start off by putting in, here this is where you have moderate evidence and minor effects. You start off by putting in some estimates of what might happen. What you're then taught to do is provide a weighting for each of those. Hugh Possingham said scoring systems suck in a very Hugh Possingham-y way, rather famously. It's a very famous quote. And he's right. So imagine you're buying a new house. So you're deciding whether or not to move in a particular area. And you'll have a number of places you could go, and you'll have a number of things, how far is it to travel? How big's the garden? How big's the house? How much does it cost? You have all of these different things. If I said, so what's the scoring of the size of the garden versus how far you traveled? How much are you going to weigh each of those? It's a meaningless question. You can't do that. But somehow that's the way this is how we employ people. This is, standard employment, give people weightings. It doesn't make any sense. What you can do, if I said to you, you can have a garden that's twice as big, but you're going to have to walk an extra 10 minutes a day to get there. All of you would make that trade-off and decide how much you compared about those two, and then decide what you're going to do. So what you do here is you say, well, that one's just too expensive, I'm not going to do that. This one has catastrophic effects on flood events, we're not going to do that. Tourism actually isn't very important, there's none of that, so we'll get rid of that. And you just simplify and simplify, find all those which is called dominated, where there's a better alternative, and then you simplify and you end up with a trade-off. Like the trade-off I've mentioned, you always end up with a trade-off because there isn't a better option, you just have to decide. You can have it so that there are fewer flood events, but it will cost more. You can have it so that the water quality is better, but there are fewer birds. You then make that decision, that trade-off, that value judgment, and that's how it works. And you can put that in. And then finally, decision trees. You can do a decision tree, and then again, this is for Australian swancress. I didn't pick this talk very well, did I? An invasive species in Britain. looking at the different ways of managing it and the different controls with the evidence, how effective it is and how strong the evidence is for each of those. Again, you can express this and show what the evidence is. So what I'm doing here is I'm saying we can improve our decision-making processes. Or we can have decision-making processes that embed evidence within it. And that we tend not to do that. We tend to just sort of make decisions without really thinking about the evidence and thinking about the process. And we could do that much better. And there's a whole literature, mainly Australian-based, on how you use experts. I'm sure you know all of that, the expert elicitation processes and how you do that. But so if you don't use these processes, it kind of can lead to catastrophic results. We've had this in the UK. I don't know how much you've been following. I'm sure you probably don't know who our Prime Minister is because we changed them most weeks. But we had one Prime Minister recently who made a set of decisions which turned out to be catastrophic. And we lost £30 billion as a consequence. And that's fine. You know, that's kind of, politicians have that right to make the decisions, even though you might not agree with them. That's kind of what politicians do. The thing that was unacceptable is that there was a process of checks and balances. There was a process by which the budgets have to be assessed and the consequences have to be assessed. There's a process by which policies are then measured, and they strip that out, they bypass that. That to me is the completely unacceptable thing. If they had followed these techniques, if they'd had an argument map for the logic of removing high-level taxation, if they'd have done structured decision-making for the different options and considered them, we wouldn't be in this situation. So imposing these methods would have a huge effect. I'd just like to talk a little bit about guidance. So we use practitioners, very understandably, don't want to look at the evidence. Similarly, doctors don't want to look at the evidence. They want to be told what to do. They're busy people, just say what to do. So guidance is really important. So mistletoe, we've got lots of mistletoes here. I don't know. Do you have mistletoe at Christmas? You know, we have mistletoe at Christmas. We like mistletoe, our mistletoe. So you can grow them. And here's some standard guidance from a very authoritative source. Harvest them, choose a tree that's similar to the type of tree in your own garden you wish to establish. Fortunately, there's no evidence for that. People are studying that, but we don't know that. Discard any crushed berries. So if I had a crushed berry, would I do throw it away, or would you just stick it on a tree? Why would you throw it away? Anyway, don't use berries from spring season's Christmas decorations. So it's not germinated, so generally harvested when immature. That might be true, I don't know. I spoke to one expert who didn't believe it, but yeah, possibly. Have a branch that's about 15 years old. But it seems that actually you want young branches. Find a natural crevice and then make a little hole, cut that in there and cover it with hessian. Young mistletoes are fantastically light sensitive. So if you do this, you'll kill them. So this is standard guidance. If you are thinking of doing mistletoe, what I would do is I'd get hold of this guidance and do the opposite from all levels of it, because it's kind of not based on the evidence. So what we need to do is we need to have guidance, but we need to have evidence-based guidance. And we're really interested in how you generate that and produce that. We talk about that quite a lot. So we kind of, and that's what medicine does, is it takes the evidence and it converts it into the guidance. What we tend to do is we just have a person who just sits down and writes some guidance without it coming from anywhere. Lots of examples from that. We looked at 200 bits of guidance in the UK. Almost none of them were based solidly on evidence, and almost none of them did it say what we want to say is, you know, based on a number of studies, it shows this. Based on one study, it shows this. Although there are no studies, it seems likely that. As this species does this, it seems sensible that. You kind of, all of those are fine, but you know where you stand. But instead, these are just expressed in an authoritative, confident manner, often just from someone sitting down and thinking through. Okay. A review of Dingo. So, oh, I see, okay. there should be should come up. There should be a screen anyway. Okay. I'd like you to work out where you think this evidence came from. What do you reckon? Well, how impressive do you think this is? It's very impressive. It is very good. That's good. I'd like you to use the evidence. Where do you think my review of dingo evidence came from, based on these authoritative statements you see? So the answer, which you'll be shocked to know, considering how good you think it is ChatGTP. It was actually really good, I thought. I'm really disappointed you haven't seen it, but anyway. So I just said, give 5 points, each 20 to 30 words with Harvard referencing, giving the scientific case for and against controlling dingoes. And it produced something that was good. So what are we going to do about this? The world is changing. Yeah, so dingoes prey on a wide range of native wildlife and take vulnerable native species. Studies have shown that areas where dingoes are present, there's a decline in the species of these species. You know, that's the kind of thing which I showed it to Misha Jackson, who was she said, this is good. Even though I can't let you find it out. So I'd just like to talk about what the consequence of this is, this way of thinking is, for academic research. So what are these for? So the standard thing we do in Cambridge, the trick we do in Cambridge, is we teach undergraduates to be given an issue and write 1,500 words about that topic in an authoritative way by looking at the literature and taking interesting perspectives and providing a balanced review and making some synthesis about. That's that they have to, many of them have to write a couple of essays a week. They're churning out large numbers of essays, and they have a final report where they're judged by how well they do that in the exam papers. And we largely examine values. We largely give the degrees by the exams. What's the use of that when you can just go to ChatGPT and say, tell us about dingo control, and it produces, people say they're largely 2-1 essays, that they've used this to get through medical school exams. It's pretty good and going to get better. So what are we going to do? We need to think about this. So the writing an essay, why are we going to teach people to write essays? Because that's an old-fashioned thing to do. I suspect what we're going to do is say, the role we're going to do is very much how do you interpret this material? How do you make decisions? How do you work out how accurate it is, how authoritative it is? How do you put that into place? All of those sorts of skills, I think, are the skills we need. This is the part of the thinking of the book. And this is the old-fashioned way, because this is pre-ChatGPT. Actually, ChatGPT came out when this was being printed. So there are elements of this. Who are we going to involve? Stakeholders and things. That's absolutely critical to do. Why is the decision important? That's what we've got to decide. But then, how can we identify and assess the pieces of evidence? All of that can probably be automated in the future. Drawing conclusions about reliability and relevance, we can probably automate a lot of that. What are the possible options? Again, we can then automate that process. What are the consequences? We then, put this in some sort of decision-making process. We can almost certainly automate multiple criteria analysis, argument maps, all those sorts of things. And then working out the trade-offs. That's where humans definitely have to be involved. You cannot have, there's not a logical answer. You've got to apply your values, your knowledge, and then deciding and implementing that, and then working out the problem. That's a human issue. So I think we're really going to have to rethink how we make decisions in the decision-making process, because a lot of this is going to be automated in the future, and the evidence space is going to be automated. And we've got to work out what our role is as scientists, what our role is as teachers, Otherwise, AI is just going to make us redundant in the same way as robotics has made manual laborers redundant. You know, that just having muscles was great when you've got to carry stuff around, but now just robots do all of that. And you think, well, at least we've got sort of brains so we can do that, but now we don't need brains because a lot of those are just done automatically. So thinking about what we need to do, I think is really important. So conclusions, as I said, research gaps. I think we need to think more about how we can combine studies, though Stuart was a bit like thought a lot more about that. How can we assess the relevance of studies? How can we assess how biased studies are? How can we automate the system so that it's, how can we have a theory of change so you can say, well, I've got this problem, and it will then automate that and automate the evidence and embed that in it. Building tests into actions, we need to do that automatically. We do that almost never. We need to standardize the approach. So lots of different measures are used. We should just make sure, unless there's a good reason, we just use the same measures. And then we need to think about guidance. We need to think about how we use AI. So that's my message. Thank you.
Bill, any questions? Any quick questions?
Thanks for that. I'm curious how you dealt with the sort of softer, like less measurable impacts, like how you could work in not just eradicating a species, but what about like community support or something that is measured is a bit harder to categorize?
Yeah. So this looks so metadata set looks at where there is data. So with the Spartino, what we did was we did the analysis of the literature, and we then said this is the measurable things, and we then said here's a set of case studies that looked at those sorts of factors, and that is one way of doing it. We don't really have ways at the moment of looking at those wider impacts, and particularly the sort of lessons of it works because we engage the community in this way. That we need to find ways of storing that sort of information, and we don't at the moment, and it's a major gap, I think. So it's a good point.
I have a question in the chat from Jason Flower. How do you make the 1 to 5 scoring for each of the 3 axes on the evidence block as objective as possible? I can imagine that those scores could be quite subjective and depend on the person doing the scoring.
So the way we view this is you making your own decision. So it can be, you can view it 2 ways. You can view it as a score that we would then provide. This is a study. But also you can view it as I'm making a decision and I'm deciding what I think about the evidence. And that's how we're thinking about it at the moment. So you would say, well, that's a study by Sutherland. I don't believe that. This is a study. This is a study from somewhere else. That seems really good. You put all of that information together yourself, so you would make that judgment. And so as an example of that, there's a study in Canada working with local communities, and the scientists respected people according to the quality, whether or not it's a published report, whether or not it's peer reviewed. The local communities wanted to know whether or not the person had been seen on the riverbank. If they weren't there and present, they didn't trust them. So their different measures of studies have a color.
That was amazing. And so your fantastic huge meta-analysis database is not visible to ChatGPT at all. So, I don't know, usually what I found is that it doesn't do references, or it doesn't do vignettes. It just makes an average. If you go and look at it, it's a made up title with a set of things that the author has written. So yeah, it's a probability based. Yeah. I think at least safe from that point of view at the moment. And so what that did is a really interesting case with the dingoes, because it found somebody with an agenda to push that is on social media all the time and cited something incorrect about how to deal with dingoes from my point of view.
So and Absolutely right. And ChatGPT isn't that great, but it's the beginning. And I was looking at it and I asked it about a question and it had something wrong. And I said, you got that wrong. And it then went back and said, well, you've actually thought about it and you're right, sorry, you got it wrong. And when I tagged it in again, it then corrected it, looking at its source. And then I tried to teach it something wrong. And tried to teach it something inaccurate. And it got a bit testy with me and said, well, you might think that, but I think and then when I put testing, it wouldn't include my incorrect information. So the way I think it works is it has this body of information which it tries to interpret and will change. But at the moment, it doesn't seem to look at databases. And you're right, and I don't actually know what those references were. But it kind of looks authoritative. It looks fine, and it will be. Surely, in a few years' time, it will be authoritative. It will pull out the proper literatures. It will, and for example, we think it doesn't. We're sure it doesn't look at conservation evidence. We've tested it in ways, and it doesn't go into there and extract that. But it should do, and I'm sure it will. And that's a different world.
So I was wondering, how do you suggest incorporating uncertainty into this framework? From a risk assessment point of view, or things that you can work on, we incorporated uncertainty in the data input, so we made it and said, as you said, those studies could be some qualitative, some quantitative, and all over, lots of variation. But also we incorporated uncertainty into output, so your meta analysis matrix at the end there. So that really expensive claim, for instance, may have a not so expensive side as well if you just change one of those options. So how do you incorporate this into this type of framework?
Yeah, so that's absolutely critical. We talk a bit about certainty in the book and risk, but I think we don't talk enough about it. So within that multi-criteria analysis, often there is sort of a range of values within, and I think you might include some of that sometimes, but and sometimes it's a single value which you kind of trust, but you need to do that, and you then need to work, in the terms of multi-criteria analysis, you could do, well, if it turns out that it comes out this way, this is the consequence, and if it turns out this way, this is the consequence, and what's the probability of that happening? That's the sort of conventional way you do it. But it is, it's harder, it's easier if you've got a meta-analysis and you can say the effect size is this with this error. If you've got other bits of information like our ziggurat plots, you can still use that. That shows the sort of uncertainty over it, but it's much harder to rigorously embed with current approaches. I think we need a lot more thinking there. How do we combine different sources of evidence into uncertainty rather than just numerical values? Is that fair?
Yeah, playing off of that with the slide where you were like, this is the straightforward guidance for the mistletoe. Would you incorporate uncertainty as another section under there, discussing, if this step fails, do this or something like that?
Yeah, so
it's not this evidence.
Also, so the real objection we have against guidance is guidance just says, do this, do this, do this. And sometimes that's based on a lot of information that's really confident. And sometimes it's just, well, we don't really know. And I think that's all right to say, well, we don't really know, but this seems quite likely. It's fine, but you want to state that. And instead, it's given complete confidence. And that's where we think guidance should be, that you kind of know where you stand and you want to know what's rigorous and what isn't. And, it might be quite sensible. We don't know, but it seems quite likely you do this. That's all right. You can bear that in mind because you know that it's not based on anything, it's based on a guess.
I have one more on the chat if there's time. Just from Zoe Lee in the mind mapping. When are you sure that you've collected enough spokes from the central species? What if there's an element you've overlooked or left out? I guess you're determining what these should be from the literature review. Share it with experts or other researchers to look for gaps in your mapping. This looks like an interesting process, but I could see one coming out very imperfectly based on the process.
Yeah, so it's not perfect, but if you accept what we do as a mental mind map, and I think this is someone's going to. Has anyone I don't know how, looking at the more senior members of staff, I imagine they've watched 10,000 decisions being made between you. At a wild guess, how many decisions have you seen being made? I imagine you've seen 10,000 decisions yourself, you know, employing people, grant assessment, all that sort of thing. How often have you ever seen anyone use anything like any structured process for making a decision?
All the time.
Yeah, you know, we don't. You know, kind of, we do this sort of rambling around the topic and not. So if you did that mind map and laid it down, one of the things it does is it lays it down so someone can say, you've missed this. There's another important element because it's all specified. But if you just have this sort of, you know, broad discussion, you've no idea what the elements are. It lays it down and makes it explicit. So, so it's not the way we did that is we brought together a group of experts, we talked about it, we then created that and then passed it around the group of experts and they commented on it. And that is not a perfect process, but better than not doing it. That's kind of, you know where you stand. You know where the evidence is, so you can criticize it.
Great, so thanks so much, everyone, and I'd also like to thank Bill again for visiting us and delivering this amazing and inspiring presentation. Thank you so much.